Doing now?
Yeah.
It says recording, but is it being streamed?
Streaming won't show.
Yeah,
Recording.
it's being streamed now. I've
All
just
right.
turned it
All,
on.
Okay.
Yeah.
all right. Hmm. I do have rights to present another screen or tab, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
your share tray is not gray, so you do.
All right. Yeah, it isn't. I do have rights to present another screen or tab, right?
yeah.
Yes,
So,
your share tray is not gray, so you do.
All right. Yeah, it is. Let me know when we can begin.
Yeah, I think the stream needs to be set up and then.
Right.
We can start whenever you're ready.
All right.
Yeah.
I think you can begin.
Go ahead.
We started yet?
Yeah, okay. So we'll just go ahead and start.
Shall we, or because it still shows videos private?
Yes, Civic.
Do we start, or is it? So how many participants are here? Is it a good number? If it is, we can begin.
Well, we had 27, now we have 19.
Ah.
we are live, Abilash.
Oh, are we? Because the link says we're private. Are you sure?
Yeah, it says the
Yeah.
same for me as well. So
Is there...
I think you need to make it available for all.
I'm sorry?
Are you at the correct link?
Yeah, the YouTube
I just
one,
texted.
right?
Check.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because for me it's showing live.
All right. Give me a second.
Yeah, we're definitely live. I can send the YouTube link here on chat.
All right, okay. If we're live, then let's just go ahead. So, hi, I'm Abilash, and I'm a fifth-year BSMS student at ISER Pune. That's pretty much my introduction. We have Satyajit here, or Professor Satyajit Rath, or Sir if you're in your first year or outside ISER Pune. Only for them. Okay, so this conversation is supposed to be more or less about how science is being communicated to the public. By public, right now I'm going to keep it as the world minus academics. So let's assume that for the moment. If Satyajit wishes to challenge it later, we'll take it up. But right now, that's the definition. So we're going to examine the social and the academic ramifications of how the interaction between scientists and the public is. So I have a small presentation here not a presentation, but I'm just going to present my screen in order to piss off Satyajit for a moment. And here we go. Yep. So can you see my screen? Can somebody confirm?
Not yet.
All right.
Sorry. Are you at the correct link? Yeah, I just texted. Check.
Now? No?
Nope.
For me it's showing live.
Damn. Oh, I think it should be now. No?
Send the YouTube link here on chat.
All right. Okay. If you're live, then let's
All right. I think I might have got it.
So hi, I'm Abilash, and I'm a fifth year.
Yeah, now you must be. So I found a couple of articles which feature in the science section of a few famous newspapers or periodicals. So can you see my screen? Just one of you
Yeah.
confirm. All right, all right. So this is one of the articles. This was a research project taken out by one of the labs here at ICER Pune. So this article, I'm just gonna briefly show it and point you to a small paragraph here which says research method, and I'm gonna just pause for 10 seconds so everybody who wants to read it can read it. And if everybody is done, I'm gonna move to another tab, which is another article that I found recently. Both of them are based on the current pandemic situation, COVID, and discoveries, inventions, or slash scientific publications that deal with COVID. So this is another article I found, and I'm just gonna leave it at this paragraph for people to read. And we'll go to another paragraph before we begin. So So I'm just going to read this paragraph out. Spike protein of the novel coronavirus shares 98% sequence identity with the spike protein of the bat coronavirus, the researchers say. And here it says SARS-CoV-2 particles are spherical and have mushroom-shaped proteins called spikes protruding from their surface, blah, blah, blah. And yep. So here we go, another paragraph. Researchers also found that, like in the case of SARS
One
coronavirus, yep,
second, sorry to interrupt,
sure, sure.
but Ajay Krishna on the YouTube stream says that they can't see the presentation.
All right, just give me a second then.
Let me figure that
Uh,
out. I'll send them the Microsoft
Actually-
Teams link.
Okay, cool.
And another thing is like YouTube has a lag of around like 6 or 7 seconds.
All
So
right.
yeah, it will take a while, I guess.
All right. So speech and video are live and presentation is a bit late? Or
No,
the whole
no, everything is a 6-second delay.
then it's pretty good, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm just gonna go with this. The researchers also found that in the case of SARS coronavirus, the spike protein of the novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19 binds to the cellular receptor called angiotensin converting enzyme 2.
We may have lost Abilash. Varun, can you hear me?
I can. I'm just trying to figure out where he went.
Actually, I guess we lost Abilash.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he is here in the meet, but Abilash, are you here? Just...
Am I back?
Yes, now you are.
Yes.
I am really sorry about that. I have no idea what happened. Okay, so let's talk about these two articles. One of them speaks of this.
Abilash,
or
you are
has-
not presenting if you are.
Yeah, no. I'm no longer presenting. I've stopped. So these two articles broadly speak about some scientific phenomenon or a new method or something of that sort. And one of the articles has a section on the research method, while the other just speaks about, researchers have found or researchers have done this or researchers have, described this as or things like that. So how does, science or the practice of science get reflected in these articles, or how do you think it should be reflected?
Okay, so let me take one step back and address two background context points that Abilash made before I respond directly to his question. The first one is that one is reminded every time people ask questions about what does it take to have science communication. I'm at least reminded of a little haiku-ish poem that a Marathi poet wrote a long time ago, which says, the question is, what does it take to write a poem? And the answer is paper and pencil. And given Abilash's travails, clearly, one of the things that science communication takes is bandwidth. So, in more ways than one. But the second background point I'm going to make is about this distinction between science communication in academia versus science communication outside academia. And I'm going to keep coming back to that again and again, because I'm going to make the argument that those two are not and should not be as different as we commonly treat them to be. So that's just a sort of broad statement of intent. And I'm going to leave it there. With those two background points, let me address Abilash's question about, do these two news reports, and they're really just news reports, newspaper reports, of two pieces of science done, reflect methods in science in ways that are, and I'm parsing Abilash, appropriate in a variety of ways? And my response is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are no inaccuracies in those two reports, or at least in the bits that Abilash identified for us. But I am afraid that in both of those news reports, in common with pretty much all other news reports, the phrase research methodology or research methods or what researchers did is understood in so extraordinarily circumscribed a fashion, so extraordinarily limited a fashion, as to be a travesty of what the practice of science ought to be. How did the scientists, how did the researchers, how did the scholars decide to ask this question? And how did they decide to ask it this way? Is really the important and relevant background for a news report as far as I'm concerned. And that's something that certainly in 95% of the times, not even acknowledged to be a question in traditional science communication. Does that address your question usefully, Abilash?
Yes, it does. And so, building upon that, so you spoke about the motivation behind the question having to be open publicly. So, what does that achieve in terms of how public perceives science? Like, what does a motivation to a question versus the results of an experiment, this contrast being published, have anything to do with the public? Why will the public be interested as to why I want to know the motivation of the scientific question rather than, hey, look, they found a new vaccine?
Right. So it's interesting that you rephrase my contextual response as motivation. It's a little bit like, is evolution driven by prior intent? And clearly, no, it's not. But the way we talk about evolution, we are almost always inaccurately implying prior intent. Anyway, so the issue of motivation can be divided into two. not two components, but two different perspectives. And those two perspectives are at the heart of a basic courteous dishonesty that is implicit in every research paper. And that is the introduction of a research paper, and I'm talking about within academia research papers, the introduction of a research paper, certainly in the life sciences where I come from, is supposed to provide an answer to this. What is this question? Why is the question important? And why did you, as the scholars, decide to address it the way that you're going to tell us about? And it's dishonest a little bit with an element of courteous dishonesty, because the way people write, me included, is not quite how it actually happened. There is much greater serendipity and happenstance about how it actually happened, and that's the bit that's not really useful. And that is what I'm connecting as my response to your question of how is motivation useful to people at large? And the motivation in terms of, is it going to fulfill my ego? Did I make an accidental observation? Was I clever enough, to build on that observation? These are uninteresting, although real, incidentals. But that's not what is truly of interest. What's truly of interest is how, in the background of what we know, what the field knows, what the specialized domain knows, in that background, how did this question arise, and how did it arise in this particular configuration of beginning to address it? And that combination of questions is, I suggest, important for not just the scholars within the narrow domain talking to each other, but all of us together to understand, because it underlines both the potential, the directionalities and interesting implications, as well as the limitations of what's being found. And all of those are crucial for everybody to understand. I'm happy to give examples of this, but I'm not going to go. I have sworn to myself that I will not go on and on, so I'm going to stop.
Right. Okay. So you spoke about happenstance and personal ego and all of that, but in general, without having any personal interest in, scientific or literature production or anything of that sort, science seems to, portray itself as something that, or at least in the mind of the public, portray itself as something as bringing out certainties or knowing, or in your own words, you said what the field or the particular specialized domain knows. So do we reflect all of scientific results or research as something that's certain? Because especially in the COVID scenario, people have actually been for the first time in history, perhaps, brought face to face with the timelines or the duration it takes for scientific research, or the uncertainties that are brought out due to in scientific research. So how much of certainty should be portrayed to the public, or should it be portrayed to the public at all?
So the way scholarship works, and you will note that rather than using terms such as science or research, I'm simply using the far broader term scholarship. The way scholarship works has a historical trajectory and a spectrum of certainty over that historical trajectory. In other words, a long time ago, something that somebody thought and something that somebody thought 100 years ago and hasn't gotten thrown out by now is quite likely to fall in the category of that's pretty all right, as reflecting a reasonable approximation of reality, of cause and effect in real life. Again, old man Darwin is a perfectly good example of that. But as you come closer and closer to present day, two things happen. One, certainty decreased, but certainty doesn't decrease in one fell swoop. In other words, it's not as if until this point we are certain and after that it's all false. Certainty declines slowly, so that last year's results are actually far more uncertain in terms of both the reliability of their veracity and the reliability of their implications as compared to last decade's results. Again, all of these are approximations. I can always find exceptions to these. But by and large, that's true. So the interesting thing that's happened during the COVID epidemic over the past year and a half now is that we have been brought face to face, we as in the broader citizenry community, have been brought face to face with this very uncomfortable sense of we're not sure of the quote facts themselves, nor are we sure of the claimed implications of facts. That's a state of affairs, that's a state of controlled franticness that scholars treat as their everyday existence.
Right.
The community has come face to face with that and is spending has spent a year and a half avoiding facing it quite frequently by trying to turn its head in 180 degrees, very enthusiastically aided and abetted by the scientific community, who really don't want the community to notice their own controlled, frantic state.
But does the reflection of, this scientific practice or the durations or whatever you said about uncertainty have to, reflect with the public, or should the public be kept away from it? And it's almost as if scientific communication up till this point has been just publication of results. But at the first time in history, we're seeing this, interface between actual scientific practice and the public. So is this a helpful thing for science communication? Does it reflect science as it is done? And is that important?
So let me disagree with you on something as a preliminary before I respond substantively. My disagreement is, I don't think that the community at large has come face to face with anything but the way scientists portray results,
right,
even now.
Okay.
In the sense that what people are seeing, hearing, and so on and so forth is how scientists put their best foot forward as research papers, even when they are non-peer-reviewed research papers, which is what preprints are on bioRxiv and medRxiv and Research Square and so on and so forth. And in all of those, scientists are attempting to communicate something that they think they've done that's really rather clever to their community. And the difference is that was contained within the community's interest until now, and over the past year and a half, it has become of immediate and pressing interest to the larger citizenry community. And this is being mediated by traditional science communication in more and more intensive, more and more time-compressed, more and more frantic ways. So, in those ways, we are seeing, in a sense, an intensification of traditional science communication. We're not seeing what I was hoping to see, which is an alteration of traditional science communication. And that I find a little distressing, because I think that traditional science communication itself is a deeply limited model to the point of being a flawed model.
Right. So, in the interest, you rather classified interest of the scientific community as interest away from the public or away from citizens. So, does the science community have anything good for itself in like sort of closing themselves and performing away from citizens and not reflecting their practice to the citizens? Because we as scientists often complain about funding or things like that. And for that, we need the consent of the society in order to perform our own research experiments or have a lab or anything that sort. So given that, how does it act in the interest of science or academics to, gatekeep science from the public? Does it achieve that, or does it sort of, harm their own?
So let me make an ethical argument here rather than a pragmatic one. You're making the pragmatic argument, which says it's to the interests of the practitioners of natural science scholarship to build a broad constituency in their own support, to let them have the funding to do the research and to have careers and pretty cushy livelihoods. I'm not certain that's the case, but let me make the more ethical argument about this, and that is that scholarship in specialized domains is a meaningless concept if it is not to be conveyed and communicated to the community at large. Because the whole point of scholarship in specialized domains is for the community at large to be empowered, not simply through information, but through models of cause and effect understanding of the world around us and the world within us, the social world as well as the natural world, which is why social science is science. And it is the predictive value, I suggest to all of us, it is the predictive value of causality related models of understanding of the world, in which we say, this is caused by this in turn is caused by this, and therefore, given that here is a causality chain as a model of understanding of this particular slice of the world, we predict that if we, as a community of human beings, do this, such and such will be the result. And if that really begins to happen, even just a little bit, that is a profound, empowering contribution to all of us. And in inclusive democratic communities, that is almost equivalent to beginning to build public policy. And if public policy is to be built by the consent of those subjected to public policy, then an empowered, understanding citizenry is crucial for evidence-based public policy that uses cause and effect models of understanding to build its own decisions is important. And if all of that matters, then science communication matters for deeply ethical reasons, and not simply so that I can have a job as a professor.
Earlier we spoke about the predictability of science or predictability of happenings, and before that we spoke about how uncertainties are rather proximal and some uncertainties are rather not proximal or very distant. So given that, and right now our conversation about having to democratize the whole cause-effect relationship, sort of the citizenry itself believes that science is something distant from us, or the citizenry itself thinks of it as an enterprise that is sort of cordoned off from the rest of us because it simply doesn't affect us. So while it should be the responsibility of the academics to breach this, how do you suggest that science communication would in fact change or should in fact change to breach this and bring about a citizenry that will rather trust science?
So, breach is a peculiarly unfortunate verb to use in this context because the
I think of it,
enterprise of science is, in fact, has been tending to behave as an elite priesthood that preaches the mysteries of science, and therefore preach is a word that I will not use. But that said, here is the issue.
Satyajit,
Yeah.
I meant breach, as in breach a wall.
Oh, breach. Right. Okay. With yeah. So let's then talk about disruption as in breach. And the issue here is uncertainty is divided into two components. Uncertainty about facts, and I'll come to what I mean by facts in a second, and uncertainty about interpretation. And let me try and explain that. And let me try and explain that in the context of what I said about uncertainties. So here's a straightforward issue. I do an experiment, and I come back to my lab mates, and I say, I did such and such an experiment, and here are the results. And my lab mates look at me and my presentation in trust, in a sort of civic, trustful courtesy, in the sense that they don't look at me and say, did he really do this experiment, or did he just make up the damn data and is fooling us? We don't do this. This is exactly what we do in our daily lives. When somebody goes out of the house onto the street, comes back and says, there's a lot of traffic today on the main road two lanes away. I don't look at my younger brother and say, is the fellow lying? This is a matter of what I'm calling the ordinary civic courtesy of trust that we have. But that trust we do not extend to two subsequent steps. The first step that we do not extend it to is we don't assume the generalization. In other words, we say, so Satyajit, how many times have you done this experiment so far? And does it happen the same? Are the results the same way every time? That's not distrust in my honesty. That is a community distrust about, is this something that can be trusted as fact before we begin to interpret it? It's sort of saying to my even younger brother, really? Hey, go out and see if the traffic is still quite that much. Before we begin trying to think about what are the reasons for the traffic and so on and so forth. That's one level of what I'm calling a civil trust linked to a next step distrust. And a third component is, all right, you've done it 4 times and clearly, it's a reliable experimental result. But you are arguing very enthusiastically that this result means that such and such a cause and effect relationship model is made very likely. Is that really the case? Or can we think of alternative and less exciting explanations for your result? And this slow seeping connection of starting from a point of trust, which I call civic, coming to a point of first empirical distrust that I call an inclusive empirical distrust, and going on to, again, an inclusive conceptual distrust. and slowly consolidating these layers of distrust into trust is how people like me, I don't speak for the theoreticians, but people like me build the ordinary empirical cause and effect relationships of, say, life sciences. For us to conflate, to sort of compress all of this into a single act of trust is both an error and a disservice. And we shouldn't be doing this. Unfortunately, remember what we're doing. We're listening to Satyajit talk about his results. And bloody fellow is showing you off, right? Bloody fellow is showing off because he wants you to be impressed by him. Bloody fellow is showing off because he thinks that he's going to get a big paper. Bloody fellow is showing off because he thinks he's going to get a big job, a big grant, whatever it is. And our response veers between trusting it in its entirety or distrusting it in its entirety. And we need our science communicators to parse this uncertain terrain, to say, hey, they did something interesting. Let's worry about how reliable the empirical component is, and let's worry about how definitive the conceptual component is. Even as we acknowledge the contribution. And it's this difficult terrain that science communication needs to navigate, and this needs to be done as much within the domain of scholarship as in the domain of the larger community. And that's why I don't think there is a major difference. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. All right. So we sort of spoke about a few principles that science sort of follows, or what people call the scientific method. We spoke about uncertainty and narrowing down our prediction to the least uncertain prediction. And then we spoke about how experimentation and developing cause-effect relationships. So if this is what's roughly the scientific method, how much of it is reflected in science communication, and why is it that only results of this whole process is communicated to the people, and how does it serve the interest of the people, be it scientists?
So let me start my response again with oblique indirection, which will surprise nobody by now. First of all, it's how we live our lives. This entire process of what everybody is calling this highfalutin Brahminical science method is how we have lived our lives for millennia. Let me go back to my example. My younger brother comes in and says, 2 lanes away, there is a big major road, and he says, there is a lot of traffic. It's very fast. And we go through my sort of, layered trust and skepticism combined. But what we are trying to do is an extraordinarily refined cause and effect model. The cause and effect model is that he, my younger brother, can cross the road, that big road, ordinarily. But beyond a certain speed and density of traffic, he cannot do so safely. Why? Because the statistical risk that he will miss an oncoming vehicle and get knocked down is high. And we are aware that this is how we are building a model of cause and effect relationships, and we are saying to him, do you think you can cross safely to go and get fresh bread from the bakery that's across that road, or do you not think so? We are trusting his cause and effect model in quantitative terms for us as a family to make policy that can have dire consequences. Priesthoods of so-called science telling us not to worry about the lived science, but to trust them. And they will tell us what public policy ought to be without going through what is our common experience of lived science, that we begin to say, oh, okay, they are building advertising for us in the name of science communication, and like all the damn fools falling for the copywriter's magic, we're falling for it.
But does it serve the interest of the scientific community?
Of course, it serves the interests of the scientific community in the sense that the scientific community gets treated as elite priesthood without having to explain itself. That's how elite priesthoods for millennia have sustained themselves as elite groups in human communities. What's new?
Right.
So, of course, it serves the interests of the scientific elite community. Of course, it allows them to connect to other elite groups, the elite groups that that control power equations, politicians, army generals, depending on whoever is ruling, whoever, and of course, people with power and people with money. So you have people with power, people with money, and people with quote knowledge unquote, and I'm putting that in quotes for the reasons that we've discussed, form a little stable tripod of elite control. Of course they will support each other. Is there any surprise in that?
Okay. So, right now that you brought it up, power relation between money, knowledge group, and the other political power. So, will the public sort of perceive, or rather not be able to resolve between the scientists as a power group and the people with money as a power group? For example, modern medicine, some features of modern medicine are seen as intervention that is done because there is money, or rather not seen as something that is absolute necessity of humanity. For example, it is sort of seen that vaccines are a scam this is in America. So with that small disclaimer, I will put the statement forward that vaccines are big pharma and things like that. So will public in general be able to resolve between science and the hold of these power groups in science?
Yeah. So let's get a couple of things clear here. Firstly, remember what I said about civic trust and inclusive skepticism as the ordinary process of both our lived lives and about how the trajectory of science moves over time. That's reality. Given that, it's no surprise that conservative cultural politics, which is based on building exclusive communities that do not use skepticism, they are antithetical. That politics is antithetical to this, number one. Number two, economic power, money power, is also based pretty much on retaining control of means of production. And retaining control of means of production is always going to prefer a larger citizenship community that's not too empowered, that's trained and skilled. Remember skilling? That's trained and skilled, but is not empowered into the model building that's participatory. And therefore, all of this politics comes together, all of this economics comes together into maintaining status quo. So, who is going to challenge the status quo? And two categories tend to challenge the status quo. One category is the American example you give, which I'm simply going to dismiss because that's so far at least not a major feature of the Indian landscape, which is an imagined, radical, non-inclusive to the point of atomistic individualist libertarian politics that therefore wants to reject any community enterprise as binding on an individual and therefore rejects science. And that's the basis for vaccines are a scam, but ivermectin used for horses and cows is not a scam. Go figure. But that aside, here is the other component of skepticism about this political power, financial power, and quote knowledge unquote power. And that comes from truly disenfranchised communities who are deeply, deeply, and with good reason, suspicious of political power, suspicious of financial power, and suspicious of so-called knowledge or priestly power, and for good reason, because all three elite groups have served let me use the formal Sanskrit term that we use, the Bahujan Samaj, very, very poorly. The socio-political context of skepticism that comes from extreme right-wing politics and from disenfranchised people and communities is quite different. And I assume, or I hope it's obvious where my sympathies lie in this, but that is a distinction that we need to make. And therefore, when communities say, hey, are these vaccines really tested properly and are they safe? Because, you know, we remember how some clinical trials have been done in our communities without adequate information, without adequate explanations, without adequate support. So we need, all of us, need to respond to that substantively and differently from when somebody says, oh, you know, Bill Gates is implanting chips through vaccines. It's all a scam for world domination by George Soros. There's a difference, and the difference needs to be underlined.
Right. Okay. Now that it's been sort of 45 minutes since we started on our conversation, I think we should go and take off questions. I will read them out. I think Varun has compiled them in a Google document. Yes. Okay. So Arun asks, regarding communicating uncertainty to the public, it feels as if the public perceives this uncertainty as a lack of knowledge, something similar to stupidity, rather than what we have trained to understand it as an uncertainty. Can we overcome this? And if yes, how?
So, can we overcome this in the short term? I don't have a good response to it. I'm hoping that some of you will come up with out-of-the-box things to try. I have not managed to be successful over a year and a half of loudly waving my arms about COVID-19. Can we do this over the intermediate and the long term? Yes. How can we do it? We can do it by changing how we teach in schools and in colleges. In colleges and universities, of course, but even more so in schools, by beginning to teach this framework of what I'm calling scholarship, of saying, what is this enterprise about? It's about trying to understand the world in cause and effect models of approximation that begin to provide us with predictive abilities that they're not perfect, nothing is, but that are good enough to serve us as inclusive community public policies. That's what we call evidence-based policies. Those evidence-based policies are things that all of us in school should be growing up as thoughtful, empowered, enfranchised citizens to participate in. And if we had this kind of a school education, rather than a school education that simply glorified people for us, we would not be in this situation of thinking about people who are telling us, this is what we think, but we're not quite sure of it, as stupid. We would think, that's what we want to hear. But can we do this over the short term in COVID? I don't know. One way to do it is for those of us who are struggling to do it to provide public critiques of the overblown claims being made, but to provide those public critiques not as, oh, those people are frauds, but as, hey, those people have an interesting set of observations, and here are the possibilities that emerge from them. Here are the limitations that emerge from them. What all of us should be asking of them is, please do a little bit more and come back and tell us. And please, can you do this quickly because we're in the middle of a pandemic? And if you want, here's a little more money. It might make you feel good, and it might make you do the work.
All right. Okay. So Ishani asks, in the domain of science communication, how do we penetrate scientific facts across a skeptical audience whose perception of the world is closely related to their political ideology? For example, anti-vax movements, pro-life movements, global warming deniers have a cult following, and rather a large one, which is grossly based on political ideology and a biased interpretation of scientific data.
Yeah. So let me offer you a slightly different perspective. Nobody's perceptions of what I'm calling the lived science of Homo sapiens, where we think about something called the future, we look at evidence, we judge evidence quantitatively in some sort of a cause and effect relationship. Really, crossing the damn road in Pune, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Kolkata, Delhi, wherever. Anyway, crossing the highway, I mean, that's lived science. It's what we do. It's what we tell each other. It's the inclusive model. Everybody does that. What it takes to deny this is, in a sense, denying our everyday humanity. We do it sometimes as an act of faith, as an act of self-abnegatory faith, self-denying faith, faith that says, amongst, let me use the word again in quotes, quote, radical, unquote, Christian communities, which say that we will leave it to the Lord. And only certain things, even in those communities, get left to the Lord. Everything doesn't get left to the Lord. They come to a street, they look left, they look right, they judge the oncoming vehicle, they judge the speed. See what I mean about quantitative risk assessment and cause and effect models for prediction, and then they cross the road. They don't just cross the road, but in matters health and medical, for a variety of sociocultural reasons, they have actively chosen to withdraw from the mundane, everyday lived science into an act of faith. So it's a very sectorally specialized gesture, and that's what all of us, those who are sort of who seem to be doing the non-science, the anti-science, the rational, are all doing it in specific sectors in which they have chosen to withdraw. The real question to ask there is twofold. Number one, how can we get our common human lived science with its empirical basis of cause and effect relationships to bleed through into the sector that they are sealing off, number one. And number two, can we ask amongst ourselves the question of what have we done, all of us together, that has forced them into denying our common humanity in this sectoral act of irrational faith? Both of those are questions worth asking.
Before we go to the next question, because we spoke about lived science, I just want to point out that lived science in our everyday world has sort of distanced itself from, let's call it science done in institutions, because there is involvement of a few factors like equipment or a lot of factors, measurement and all of that. So how does one reconcile, the public that does lived science and the academic elite who do equipment science, for example?
Arey yaar, this is all just, we are letting the elites fool us. Let me point out, this distinction that you're making is exactly the same distinctions as the distinction between the gaon ka chuha and the shahar ka chuha, or the gaon ki chuya and the shahar ki chuya, to use proper Hindi. Acha, gaon ki chuya ko I apologize, I will translate. गांव की चूहिया को पता है कि किस कांटे से चुभन ज्यादा देर तक रहती है. The country mouse knows which category of thorn leaves a much longer sense of hurt. The city mouse doesn't know that. शहर की चूहिया को पता है कि गाड़ी कितनी जोर से, कितनी रफ्तार से आ रही है और मैं जा पाऊं या ना जा पाऊं. These are simply different lived sciences. And the resolution of that is the resolution of our common humanity. Can we talk to each other about them? Tell each other. Come with me and I'll show you. See, that one is coming really fast. We shouldn't go. Oh, that one, it's coming slow enough that we can go across. नहीं यार, मैंने समझ में नहीं आया. अच्छा, we'll check it out on the next street, and then we'll check it out in the next street. Oops, sorry. Let's run back. I miscalculated. Even my guesses are not really great. These are the conversations that we need to have with each other. And this is exactly the conversation that one lab needs to have with another, that one specialty domain needs to have with another, that so-called scientists need to have with so-called non-scientists. Without pretending that we are better than them.
So you prescribe humility as a feature of scientific praxis.
I'm pointing out that it is a damned empirical feature, because the non-humble get run over. Darwin.
All right, Varuni asks, assuming that the majority of the populace is ignorant, I do not believe this. There are many brands whose major selling point is that the product has been scientifically tested or approved by n number of doctors, or try to add in sciencey terms to advertise them. How do people discern whom to trust? Is the onus on them to research to figure out if those products are actually safe to use, or is it on the scientists to convey to them? If it is on the scientists, how do they know to trust the scientists and not the brands?
So, in the first place, so let me say this in nakedly political terms first, personal political terms first. If somebody is trying to sell you something, assume they're lying. Okay, so that's just upfront politics. But that said, here's the straightforward question. When we talk to each other, each one of us has vested interests. In ordinary everyday life, again, we deal with those vested interests in remarkably nuanced ways. Within families, we deal with vested interests. मौसी ने कहा कि वो यूं हुआ, लेकिन वो मौसी के बेटे का उसमें कुछ है ना, right? We deal with the idea of vested interests in this framework I'm calling everyday science, where we take statements of fact with an element of civic courteous trust and a subsequent inclusive skepticism, first an empirical skepticism and then a conceptual skepticism, that we address. We address it because we want to address it. We address it not individually in our own little corner, but inclusively, including the person about whose finding we are sort of doing this civic skepticism, because the outcome matters to all of us. We do that in our families, we do that in our neighborhoods, we do that in our peer groups. What? We trust our peer groups to the point of thinking naively that that Abilash is telling me something, and Abilash to yaar sant aadmi hai, he cannot have vested interest. Give me a break. Of course not. But am I going to look at Abilash and say, Sala chor hai, jhoot bolta hai, all the time? No. We deal with each other in socio-culturally nuanced fashion in our daily lived science. What's wrong with doing that in what we have sealed off as specialized scientist wala science? Jahan, what we do here, why don't we do there? Question. But question not by saying that all of this is nonsense. Question by saying, Acha, tell us a little bit more about it. So, should you do your own research? Yes. But should you do your own research by asking your cousin in Trinidad whether his friend's testicles swole when he took vaccine? Everybody is familiar with Nicki Minaj?
Oh.
Who?
I think they are.
Somebody will Google, I presume. So don't do that. Stay with what for millennia has served the species well. Say, oh, that's interesting evidence. Say, is it good evidence? Is it robust evidence? If it is robust evidence, should we ask a few other people if they have similar evidence, and so on and so forth? And is the conceptual interpretation you're putting on it reasonably valid? Those are the questions we need to ask. We need to ask those of Procter & Gamble as much as we need to ask them of bioRxiv or a medRxiv preprint.
Before we go, but there's this, I hate to say it, a notion of expertise associated with a scientist, right? For example, I am not in the life sciences, but when I read this article in a book, I sort of see these terms AS2, and then and this is already a sort of watered down article. And when you have to reflect the scientific method or the practice that's been going on to arrive at this result, you're going to speak about more of these so-called scientific terms, right? How do you translate this, or how does it?
Right. So three layers of response to this. My first response is so-called specialization falls in my village mouse, town mouse category. There's no specialization more problematic than that. That's one. But the second point is, and for once I'm going to say something that has pleased me enormously over the past year and a half, which is that journalists across the world, in their vast majority, have actually done a remarkably good effort at trying to convey, in however circumscribed a fashion, the reasonable stuff that's going on. So the reports that you cited, that you showed, and that was a good idea, Abilash, fall in those categories. If you read through the text, it's not bad at all. It's stuff that you can say, oh, okay, that's interesting. I'll think about it. I'll read about it a little bit more. But that's sort of some provisional stuff that I can hold in my head. However, for those journalists, the sub-editors who write the captions and the headlines have been doing a remarkably bad job. That difference is because the journalists who write the text or who do the actual podcasts have been functioning like this ordinary working stiffs, the scientists who are actually doing the work. The higher-ups who are putting captions and they are writing advertising copy. And they are writing advertising copy in the service of elite preoccupations, exactly the same way that the scientific leadership, the scientific establishment, is interpreting ordinary science. I mean, everybody's read this news reports coming out about ICMR and COVID data and so on and so forth, I assume. And that underlines the point that I'm trying to make. So, the heartening thing is that journalists across the world, many of whom were not specialized science journalists, leave alone health science journalists, before the pandemic began, have rolled up their sleeves and have come into this in what I think of as broadly laudable fashion. Are there exceptions? Sure, there are. But certainly the overwhelming majority. The leadership behaves the way leaderships behave. So here is a way of trying to decide what to read a little more.
Okay. We have a couple of questions, and I think with that we can close. If anybody else has a question, please raise your hand. I find it very, Arya says, I find it very hard to contextualize the discourse of science in India, whereas opposed to, say, USA, not disregard science outrightly, but try to create a narrative that we already knew science in the Vedic period, or that we look into our past and decode our understanding of, say, bodily chakras, which might lead to rediscovered knowledge. I have seen audience members ask such questions in high-profile public talks who are politely just thanked for their question and brushed apart. When I feel at the very instant, the speaker should forget everything about the esoteric research and at least explain the problem of narrative, because rebutting such people propagates that same idea in 10 other neutral people in the talk who might take that up as a genuine question.
So I'm not quite sure I got...
Abilash credited
Yes.
rebutting such people. He missed a not before the rebutting.
Oh, okay.
Change the meaning.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I caught the entire drift of the question, but let me respond, and please feel free to correct me and to drag me back to the point. But here's the issue. For example, Shiva went to see Parvati and she was bathing, and Ganesha, who was a hale and hearty young man, was sitting outside guarding her privacy. He didn't know who this was, so he protested, and Shiva cut his head off, and then Parvati and Shiva had a little small conjugal dispute, subsequent to which, for a variety of incidental reasons, an elephant head Shiva put back on Ganesha's torso. See, we knew about transplant surgery. I'm aware that this sounds like a claim about science. Let me point out that this is not actually a claim about science. It's not being made as a serious claim about science. They know, I know, you know, we know, everybody knows that emperor ain't got no clothes. This is a claim about the primacy, the dominance of a particular cultural political narrative. It's like, when children are quarreling, and one of them says, well, you said such and such. And the other guy says, no, I didn't say anything. Who says I said? I didn't say anything. No, I didn't say anything. And the fact of the matter in this is that this is really just tutu meh, from this side at least. In that, this disclaimer that I didn't say anything, he knows, and the other party knows that this is not true. In the mundane, factual sense of not being true. So these claims are actually not about science. They are simply using the common ascribed valorization that has been provided over the past century to the scientific method in order to make an even louder claim. Really, that's all this is about. So, should we respond to this? Sure, we should respond to this. How should we respond to this? Here's science communication. Here's how we should respond to this in a way that I have struggled and I am completely incompetent to do. We should come up with science-based mockery of these claims, not explanations, or more correctly, not earnest and, but it's not like that kind of explanations, which, as you point out, simply provides prominence to the claim. But a subversive mockery in response that's based and grounded in actual science. My problem is, I don't ever manage to do this well. My hope is some amongst you will. I hope that was an on-target response. You don't have to agree, but I hope that was the question.
There's a follow-up by another person, Arun. To follow up on Arya's question, why is such a mentality more prevalent in India than in other places? I'm not sure that's true.
Isn't. So my straightforward response is, it's not. So let me go back to the original classification I made a little bit. about people who deny these things, and I said there is an extreme sort of quasi-individual, pretend individualist, because it's the American foundational myth that they as individuals built the Wild West frontier, land from sea to shining sea and so on and so forth. Everybody's got their own myths in their very nature. None of them are really true. But there is that as a form of elite identity politics. And there is the deep skepticism of elite science. Remember, since we are talking about American structures, the Tuskegee medical experiments on people treated as not volunteering participants, but as unknowing subjects and so on and so forth. Underclass communities, disenfranchised, underprivileged communities, always look at power, whether it is political power, whether it is financial power, whether it is priestly power, with fear and skepticism for good reason. And these need to be looked at and responded to differently. That said, for these two reasons, across the world, there are broadly anti-science sectoral claims and movements. They exist in Brazil, they exist in Europe, they exist in the United States, they exist in Southeast Asia, they exist in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is, ये सिर्फ हमारी विरासत नहीं है.
Okay. We have a last question.
One second, just before that, Akshita has raised their hand.
Sure.
There's a raised hand.
Sure. Akshita, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Because we're talking about science communication right now. So do you think social media has done more harm than good in spreading information? Because you brought up the Nicki Minaj example, right? And a lot of people are going to go behind her and follow what she said. So because most social media pages and groups are just echo chambers, so you don't really learn anything new. Your view gets reinforced. So do you think when it comes to science and spreading research and the like, that social media has done more harm than good?
So I was kind of hoping that nobody would ask me this question, because I'm going to come across as the old fart that I am, and I apologize. But in a sense, it is my reason for not being on social media so far. I might come to it, but so far. And my reason for that is what social media uncomfortably reminded me of. They remind me of, all right, a fair proportion of our audience will find this familiar. They remind me when I went from a boys-only school here in Pune, Marathi medium school, to here in Pune, Ferguson College. And one of the transitions consisted of groups of boys, we were 15, hanging out. And the kinds of conversations that began to emerge in those gossiping groups that reminded me of the times when, as a school kid, I had been playing in ancestral villages in and around trees, around chopals, where again the men gathered and talked to each other. And that edgy, echo chamber amplifying gossip with a nasty edge, nasty in a variety of ways, is what I'm afraid social media still remind me of. So I ain't on social media. And since that's my take on social media, a little sadly, I come across as old fart in this. However, I will still say this. Is it possible to use social media? Yes, it is. You know, it's a little bit like, sure, there is this echo chamber, there is this, there's that, and so on and so forth. But for better or worse, it's there. Can all of you who are native to these media keep trying innovative, disruptive ways of breaking through the echo chambers in ways that are useful, ways that are inclusive? I don't know.
Akshita, is that good?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you for your answer, sir.
All right. We will end with this question by Arun. In the context of COVID, how is it so that evidence-based medicine was not able to appeal to people as much as traditional or alternate medicine? One thought that came to me was emotional appeal of tradition to people. So should we be learning from this and try to make science communication more emotionally appealing rather than through logical reason in the short term? In the longer term, we can try to inculcate scientific temper, as we mentioned earlier. Oh my God.
So it's a great question. And unlike Abilash, I am not going to, I hope, throw the baby out with the bathwater. But if you will, bear with my indirections for a minute or two. Let me make a couple of points here. One is that there is nothing particularly special about the COVID pandemic. You talk to my friends who practice medicine on an everyday basis, right? So, a story that an oncologist friend of mine never fails to come back to every once in a while with laughter is, when patients get well, it is because, they've been taking some homeopathic medicine, they've been taking some Ayurvedic jadi booty, or they went and did some home havan, or they went and somebody put some Baba Maharaj put their hand on their head and said that you will get better to see your grandson be born, so on and so forth. When they die, it's the fault of my surgery, my chemotherapy, my radiation, whatever it is. So this is while I'm trained as a physician, I have not practiced as a physician, but amongst the community, this is entirely familiar. It's just quantitatively more intense, but it's not qualitatively different. First. Second, should we therefore respond with making the emotional appeal? And if you can do that, again, it's a little bit like what I said about not being able to do science-based mockery well and not being able to handle disruptive innovations in social media well. Here's a third one that I don't know how to do, but I'm kind of hoping that there will be those amongst you. Can you include the emotional ideas of inclusivity, of humility, of honesty, of humanity as the quintessential underpinnings of what I'm calling our lived species enterprise of science? That we look at the world with curiosity, we observe phenomena, we try to connect them in cause and effect relationships, we worry about whether what we are seeing is correct or not, whether what we are thinking is correct or not, and we talk to each other. And we talk to each other with a civic courtesy that takes claims as correct, but brings skepticism to interpretative layers. Can we bring an emotional, cultural, normative narrative to be built around this? If we can.
Right. Are there any more questions to people in this meeting? Varuni, are there any on YouTube? As far as I know, no.
No, that's about it. Yeah.
All right.
If there are any more follow-ups to the previously asked questions, then go ahead and ask.
All right.
Everybody's tired. It's been
an hour and a half or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the managing editors of Inventa are here. Do you have any advice for them? Comments? No, Satyajit?
No. Hey, I've already talked enough.
Because this is supposed to be a science communication venture, especially run by postdocs and undergrads. Your thoughts?
Oh, okay. So I brought up 3 points. Can we build a community based on these human attributes? And can we, on the basis of that community, build science-based mockery on the one hand, and careful, open-minded, skeptical, and pushy participation in the narratives in social media.
Right. All right. I guess that's pretty much it with this event. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Satyajit.
Thank you all very much.
As it's been practice with anything that starts a talk program, Satyajit has been invited and a talk is completed. So Savrish, is there anything to be done? Varuni?
I don't think so. I think this shall be the end of the talk.
All right.
So thank you, Satyajit and Abilash, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you all.
And thank you, everyone.
Good night.
All right.